If you're anything like me, you grew up playing Call of Duty. And one Call of Duty that always stood out specifically was Call of Duty World at War. This game was undoubtedly the catalyst for my fascination with the Second World War. And recently, while doing one of my late night History Channel binges, I came across some really interesting weapons. So in this video, I put together a list of some of the weirdest and most obscure weapons from World War II. Oh, and these are going to start weird, but get even weirder. First up, we have the Krummlauf, which is a German invention. The Krummlauf itself is not a weapon, but it is a weapon modifier. The Krummlauf is a barrel extension for rifles, similar to a suppressor, although this one was curved with a 30-degree angle. Although it seems like something out of Looney Tunes, the purpose was quite ingenious. The Krummlauf was used for close quarters combats in urban situations, specifically shooting around corners and over trenches. The Krummlauf wasn't typically blind fired, as it also had a periscope attached to it to also see around the corners. As useful as this item may appear, it wasn't extremely practical because it had a few major downsides, mainly accuracy and durability. The periscope, typically fastened with the Krummlauf, was very susceptible to fogging up, which left huge room for inaccuracy, and the Krummlauf itself was very susceptible to the immense forces behind a bullet, not only controlling the bullet but also redirecting that bullet, and they typically were only good for a maximum of 300 shots. Personally, I think the look of the Krummlauf is one of the weirdest things about it. I think the idea isn't bad, it's just wasn't able to be executed properly. The Krummlauf is weird, but there's definitely weirder, which is why it's only the first entry on this list. Next up, we have the V3 Supergun, and super it is. The V3 Supergun was developed as a so-called vengeance weapon in order to strike back at London as Allied bomber fleets pounded German cities to rubble. The V3 cannon was capable of delivering a 140-kilogram shell at a range of over 161 kilometers. But big deal, right? Wow, a cannon that could shoot a little bit further. What's so special? Well, one of the most unique attributes about the V3 Supergun is how it achieved this enormous range, and its unique engineering. The secret to this enormous range and what made this gun truly special was a number of side channels attached to the 140-meter long barrel. These channels were filled with additional propellant which would be triggered by the shell as it traveled through the long barrel. Essentially what would happen is the shell would trigger the propellant as it would fly down the barrel, which would cause the propellant to explode, giving even more velocity. The long barrel with these channels would essentially allow the shell to be fired multiple times without even leaving the barrel. The best analogy I can think of is when you're playing Mario Kart and you drive on a speed boost. That's basically what's happening inside the barrel. To me, the engineering behind this concept is really interesting, but the weirdest part is definitely the fact that the barrel was literally almost 500 feet long. Despite all the research, development, and resources that were put into this weapon, it wasn't really able to be executed properly. During some demo tests, it wasn't able to meet its hypothetical potential, and before they were able to truly implement it, they were destroyed by the Allied forces bombing and destroying the gun. Later, smaller variants were used on bombing raids against Luxembourg, but that's not what we're talking about here. What we are talking about, however, is something the Russians did that I don't like at all. And you're not going to like it either. That being anti-tank dogs. Yeah, this one is exactly how it sounds, unfortunately. The Russians were strapping bombs to dogs for them to detonate under tanks. How they do this? Well, in training, they would starve these dogs and then hide food under stationary tanks so the dogs would know to look under tanks for food. They would then bring these same dogs to the battlefield with bombs strapped on their backs. The idea was that the dog would run under an enemy tank and then the bomb on its back would explode. Besides this being extremely primitive and brutal, this technique was also extremely ineffective. On the battlefield, these dogs were extremely scared of these tanks charging towards them, and combined with enemy fire, they wanted nothing to do with these enemy tanks. Also, some of these dogs would go back towards Russian tanks, hiding below them, causing friendly fire. Overall, this method is completely horrible and honestly not great. This technique is pretty on point for Russian military exercises, as their whole mentality is essentially throw bodies at something until the problem's solved. But anyway, staying on trend with explosive animals, we have our next entry, which is explosive rats. This one is interesting because it was a failure that actually turned into a pretty massive success. The British military weapons design team was looking for interesting ways to infiltrate the German infrastructure. Obviously, they were getting desperate because where they landed was explosive rats. This differs from the explosive dogs because these rats were no longer alive. The rats were found, killed, skinned, and essentially taxidermied but filled with a plastic explosive. These rats would be planted in and around coal storages on German bases, with the intention of having them be thrown in the incinerator and boilers, triggering the explosive and causing a massive explosion. Now, here's where things get interesting. The Germans early on caught on to these explosive rats, and the British, because of this, stopped producing them. But Germany didn't know that, and because of that, the Germans were extremely paranoid about more explosive rats and spent a lot of resources and man-hours strictly checking rats, dead and alive, on all of their military bases. Despite the fact that the rats were more effective than the dogs, and I would say arguably less upsetting, I wouldn't say that this method is much better. For our third and final animal-based entry on the list, we have pigeon-guided missiles. Yep, you heard me right. Pigeon-guided missiles. But unfortunately, it's not as cool as it sounds. The birds that your grandma likes to throw bread at isn't also a double agent. Their primitive brains were just used for tracking, which is still pretty interesting. B.F. Skinner was a psychologist and a passionate pigeon trainer who believed that pigeons could be useful weapons of war. He was ultimately able to prove his theory right, as he was able to teach pigeons how to recognize targets and aim weapons accordingly. The pigeons had specially designed cockpits inside of these missiles which allowed them to peck their way to pick the direction they wanted the missile to go, pecking up, down, left, or right to control the missile accordingly. It's strange and insane to think that pigeons can be trained to literally guide missiles, but it's also kind of unfortunate that these birds were unintentional kamikazes. What was intentional, however, was our next entry, the Japanese Fugu balloon bomb. These bombs were extremely primitive in nature, being constructed solely out of paper. These paper bombs were huge, 33 feet in diameter for the most part, and could lift up to 1,000 pounds, but all they were lifting were 33-pound anti-personnel fragmentation bombs. The Japanese released these bombs into the Pacific jet stream, which would silently carry these large devices from Japan to the US without any pilot, and the trip would take several days. Despite releasing thousands of these devices, the balloon bomb was extremely ineffective, not to mention resource intensive. It took up to 30 minutes to an hour to prepare one balloon and required 30 hands on deck to create one. During the war, there's only 6 casualties reported from the balloon. A minister's wife and 5 Sunday school children were on a fishing trip encountered the balloon near Oregon, and sadly they fell victim to it. Although for this weapon to be considered successful, it would mean the death of people, which is obviously unfortunate. It is kind of laughable how ineffective this weapon was, considering all the time and energy that went into it. Finally, we have the last entry of this list, the Panjandrum. The Panjandrum never saw combat, but for reasons we'll get into, it was a fan favorite amongst civilians. The best way to describe the Panjandrum is a British-made rocket-powered wagon wheel battering ram, if that makes sense. To find a way to breach Germans' concrete defenses in Normandy, the British military devised a large carriage-like contraption called the Panjandrum. The device was propelled by rockets attached along the rim on the outside of the wheel, and in the middle there was a drum full of explosives. The goal was to have the Panjandrum speed towards the wall and break through it and eventually explode. The concept sounds simple enough and honestly kind of makes sense if you don't really think about it. But the biggest problem facing the Panjandrum was the fact that there are so many technical inconsistencies and issues. Rockets blowing off, the wheel going in the wrong direction, not generating enough force to penetrate the concrete wall. Although the general public enjoyed watching the live demonstrations of the Panjandrum, it was never brought to battle due to all of the technical inconsistencies of it. Besides the fact that all of these weapons were complete and utter failures, they all have one thing in common. They are weird. And they sucked. But let me know, which one is your favorite or least favorite? For me, the dog method was the worst by far. If there's anything that I missed or if you wanted to see a part 2, please let me know down in the comments. And if you like this video, subscribe for more. We have cool videos coming out all the time. Trust me, bro.